So much media, so little time. Who keeps track of it all? That would be me. This is Bob Andelman, and this is the Mr. Media Interview, recorded live on blogtalkradio.com from the new Media and American League Baseball capital of the world, St. Petersburg, Florida. Hank Rosenfeld found the kind of book-writing job that guys like me salivate over. He met Irving Brecker, a brilliant and funny writer from the golden age of Hollywood comedy, and spent hours and hours recording stories from Irv about everyone from Groucho Marx and the Marx Brothers to Judy Garland and Jackie Gleason. The wicked wit of the West, as Groucho called him, lived a long and productive life, starting out writing one-liners for Milton Berle in the 1930s, two Marx Brothers films, punching up the humor in The Wizard of Oz, writing and convincing Judy Garland to star in Meet Me in St. Louis, creating the long-running radio and TV sitcom, The Life of Riley, and writing the original film version of Bye Bye Birdie for Dick Van Dyke and Ann-Margaret. And that's just a couple of things. This guy had an amazing career, Mr. Brecker. Now, lucky for us, Brecker maintained a magnificent memory of the events of his life and spent his last years telling his stories to Hank. Now, Rosenfeld produced a book that is mostly Brecker's memoir, with some bits of Rosenfeld thrown in to kind of fill in the gaps and kind of lead the conversation. The Wicked Wit of the West is a terrific read for any fan of comedy, particularly the Marx Brothers, Milton Berle, Jackie Gleason variety. It gets my personal and highest recommendation. And Hank, welcome to Mr. Media.
Well, I don't know what to say. That's really lovely of you. Hello, I must be going?
Yeah, I was going to say, I know if someone said that to me, I'd probably say, I think I better stop now.
Well, greetings and salutations to all your listeners out there, and it's great to be with you, Bob.
Thanks. Good to have you. It's funny how this conversation came about. I had Mike Sachs on my show a couple weeks ago. He was promoting a book called And Here's the Kicker, where he had interviewed Irving among 21 writers, comedy writers, and I'll be honest, I did not know, I knew his work, obviously, but I didn't know his name, and had read that, and then literally, I think, as soon as I got off the air with Mike, I heard from your publicist and sent me a copy of your book, which is, it's a wonderful book, and then to read it after reading the Q&A that Sachs did, it just continues to expand on the story, and it's just a great read. I love the way it's done. It's a lot of it starts with a question from you, and then Irv just is cut loose. It's been fun to.
It was a lot of fun, but I didn't know who he was either. I think that's the whole idea. Who is this guy, Irving Brecker? When I found out about him, I just wanted to tell other people about him, and I was doing a story for the LA Times, actually, as a freelance writer about the golden age of Hollywood, because Turner Classic Movies, TCM, comes into LA once a year from Turner, I guess that's Atlanta, and they interview these old-time stars, get them on their archives before they die, and one of the guys they were doing was this Marx Brothers writer, Irving Brecker. I'd never heard of him. When he started talking about the Marx Brothers, I just had to kind of stalk him and get more information. Yeah.
How long did it take to convince him to do this, and then how long were you actually with him, interviewing him and compiling this?
We met in 2001, and it took months. He made me write a couple of articles first about him, one for the Times and then one for the Forward newspaper in New York, and then I finally convinced him, and then we spent the next 7 years going back and forth and around town at delicatessens and screenings of his films, and he would be doing stand-up comedy into his 90s. I'd go see him there, and I just made sure to tape everything he said, and we finally got a book out of it that this small publisher in New Jersey brought out, The Wicked Wit of the West.
And, it's so packed with Hollywood stories and behind-the-scenes stuff. Now, I mentioned the comedians that Irv wrote for and worked with, but there's also a lot of insight into the Hollywood movers and shakers. There's stories of Dory Sherry and L.B. Mayer and
Mervyn LeRoy.
Yeah, I mean it's a real classic Hollywood story from multiple eras. And I didn't mention this in the beginning, but now Irv passed away very recently, right?
Last November, and the book came out in January.
Jeez.
But he got to see it. I mean, he had glaucoma the last few years of his life, so he couldn't see. But I got to read it to him in those last few months, so he gave final approval. You know, being such a wordsmith, just a word master, this guy was a perfectionist, writing jokes for Milton Berle and Henny Youngman. You know, he had to make sure it was right, and so he gave final approval, and that took a couple of years also.
Yeah, I'm sure. Now, the book, one of the things I thought was interesting is you're, and this is amazing, again, because of the man's age. He's like 87 by the time you start working with him. Mm-hmm. And he, we find out in the book how he got his start. He had worked at that the little theater.
Carnegie.
Little Carnegie Theater, right. And we get him as a teen, what's going on in his life. We see him develop and start working with Milton Berle. I mean, the detail is so amazing. And I mean, since the book has come out, has anyone challenged any of the detail or his stories?
Well, there was a very interesting thing that for years people thought that there was a picture of Groucho Marx going around, and it turned out that in this book, Irv mentioned that it was him, that Groucho got sick one day in the late of 38, and Irv dressed up as Groucho and took the photo, a publicity shot, and it went out. What they used to do is go town to town and do their movie scripts as vaudeville, you know, testing the material. So they went to Detroit and Chicago and Joliet, and they played these old vaudeville theaters, and there was Irv's picture with Chico and Harpo, and everybody thought it was Groucho for years and years, and Irv revealed in this book that it was him. Because it was very strange, because when Irv was a kid in the Bronx growing up during the Depression, he used to dress up as Groucho to entertain his friends. Here he was, 10 years later, writing for them.
That's amazing. And wasn't the person who identified it, wasn't like Groucho's daughter or somebody's daughter?
Yeah, Miriam Marx, Groucho's daughter, recognized. She said, "Daddy doesn't have that ring." Irv wore a ring in the photo to tip off his wife. Wow. That it was him. I mean, it should have been obvious, because Irv was only 25 years old, and when he was writing for the Marx Brothers in the late 30s, they were already in their late 40s. They'd kind of had it. You know, this was near the end of their career, Go West and At the Circus, 39 and 40.
Well, and speaking of photos of Groucho, there's two that I loved, because it occurs to me, I don't think I guess I'd seen You Bet Your Life, the TV thing, the TV show that he did, and you know he wasn't wearing all the makeup there, but I had never really seen a picture of him at the height of his success, sort of without the makeup. And you've got a picture of him that Irv took where he had gone fishing. That was a great story. But there's a picture of him holding up a fish that he caught, and there's a picture of him at the it's not the Sands, with the Flamingo, right?
It might have been that's right, at the Flamingo Hotel in Vegas. Yeah.
Yeah, with his overripened tomatoes, but I mean, you look at it, and for a minute you go, well, that's just another older Jewish guy, and then you look real hard and you go, oh my God, it really is Groucho.
That's right. This was in 1947. Irv took Groucho on his first time they'd ever been fishing. They went up to Wyoming and caught that fish that's in the photo, and they also got thrown out of a hotel by guys with guns. Had to climb out the window. He had a lot of adventures with Groucho, and on the way back from that trip in Wyoming, Groucho called back to his agent, and there had been a call from a producer who wanted to know if he'd like to do a radio game show. And he came back to the car and said, "I don't want to do that. That's for idiots. I'm an intellectual." And Irv and the other guys in the car, there were four of them, said, "You know, you don't know. You don't know what can happen, Grouch. Why don't you try it?" Turned out to be You Bet Your Life, and it paid for the rest of Groucho's life.
Mm. And there was another great try. I see, you can tell, if people listening to this haven't read the book, you can tell I love this book. There was the first time that Groucho and Irv traveled together, they went to a restricted club in, was it North Carolina or South Carolina?
West Virginia, actually.
West Virginia. Sorry.
What the heck was the name of that place? I want to say White Cliff or something like that.
Greenbrier, White Cliff.
There you go, Greenbrier, White Cliff. It was a big Gentile hotel, whatever.
Some fakakta place.
They didn't like actors, and they didn't like Jews. And they didn't like Groucho. making fun of them.
That was right. That was the thing. They didn't like having the real thing there making fun of him, but they loved having his movie.
Yeah, they traveled down to this place, the Greenbrier, and they went down there to play golf and hang out. And the first thing Groucho says when he walks up to the reception desk is it true you run a chain of brothels coast to coast? And that caused a big to-do. They ended up giving them a broom closet to sleep in, and the next night At the Circus was showing at the country club, which was very odd.
Did you get a sense from Irv after all these years that he still had the same fondness for Groucho that he did when he was a kid, or had it worn on him a little bit after so many years?
Well, Groucho would embarrass him in public, and so he thought Groucho was not as sweet, obviously, as Harpo. He really loved Harpo, who called him Irv the Nerve, because Irv was so high-strung as a young writer that he gets so nervous trying to write these. It was very difficult trying to write the Marx Brothers movies. And Groucho always wanted to be a writer. His best friends were writers like S.J. Perlman and those fellas that wrote, some of his earlier movies. And he supported Irv's scripts. And Irv said that Harpo was the easiest to write for because there weren't any words. And that Chico was the toughest to write for because he was never around. He was never on the set. He was always chasing chicks, hence the name. And that Groucho was a big supporter because he was a writer. And he thought that Groucho hated acting, and it was a pretty depressed figure over time. Mm. Whereas Harpo remained sweet, and Chico was just an inveterate gambler and horse player, and was always broke and pulling all kinds of stunts to keep the Marx Brothers movies going. Mm-hmm.
And I we want to make clear for people who are listening, who are hearing a pronunciation from you that they may not recognize, but there's a great story behind it. Most people think it's Chico because that's the way we, Chico and the Man these days. We pronounce it that way, but it was Chico. And did Irv tell you? I think there's a story where Irv tells you that it was Chico because, as you say, he chased the chicks all the time. But most people, years later, who don't have that exposure, just think it's Chico.
Chico. Yeah, you would think it was Chico, and from television we learned Chico and the Man. But yeah, apparently he chased every extra, and he's not in a lot of the photos of that time. There's a whole group photo of the entire cast and crew of At the Circus, and Margaret Dumont, of course, and the singing leads, and Groucho, and all the circus characters. There was a guy in a gorilla costume, and a tightrope dancer, and strongman. But there's no Chico in that picture. He's gone. But he saved the Marx Brothers, Irv said. There's a chapter in the book where Chico played cards at the country club they hung out in with one of the production heads of the studio. And he got so far behind that the production guy said, well, how are you going to pay me back? And Chico said, well, if we did another picture, maybe we could get some money. And the guy said, I'll try. I'll see what I can do. They got him a few $100,000 to do some more movies at MGM, and he never beat Chico in cards again.
Yeah. It was all a setup, but it was a wonderful setup. Oh, man.
Great characters.
What were some of the things, all the stories that Irv told you, what were some of the stories that, that you could tell brought out the most pride and that he was most excited to tell and share?
He loved that movie, Meet Me in St. Louis, because it's over 60 years old and people still watch it. It's still on TV. The songs, Have Yourself a Merry Little Christmas, Judy Garland, you still hear it every year around Christmas time. And he just loves that he was involved in this movie from 1944 that was a real sweet tale of an American family. There wasn't any villain in the movie, and they used Technicolor, and the songs are so great, clang, clang, clang goes the trolley. And the fact that he had to convince Judy Garland, there's a chapter in the book where he has to read the entire script to Judy Garland because L.B. Mayer said, she doesn't want to do the picture. She thinks she'll be outshone by the little girl in the movie, Margaret O'Brien. Yeah, Tootie. So Irv, he tells a story in here about how when he read the script to Judy, who he knew from parties, she'd come over to his house, and sing, which to me, I'm just fantasizing about this Hollywood that he lived in the 30s and 40s and 50s, you know. But he read the script to her, and he says he sold every line to her like it was Shakespeare. And when he got to Margaret O'Brien's lines as Tootie, he just kind of threw them away. He said they weren't even there. And she agreed to do the picture. Meet Me in St. Louis was the biggest picture she'd ever done up to that time. It was, 1944. It was bigger than The Wizard of Oz for MGM at that time.
Well, and one of the things that we learn about Irv, he's a great storyteller, but he clearly did not appreciate when other people took credit for his work or the things that he did, even when it came to who got Judy Garland to do that movie. There was you tell a story about that it was someone else took credit or was given credit for it later, and that just pissed him off.
Yeah, they'd make these videos that, the commentary tracks that would go along. When the DVDs started coming out, they would have documentaries about the making of and these old stories. And, of course, these stories would get switched around, so the producer would take credit for doing that and things like that. He was very upset. He was also very upset with the Bush administration. I tried to ask him questions about George Burns, and all he wanted to tell me is about what George Bush had done that day, It was hard to keep him on track.
Yeah, well, there's a number of lines that he drops in. You reproduce several of the speeches that he gave and the talks that he gave to groups in his later years, and he was always dropping in these one-liners about George W. Bush. You could tell he wasn't too happy.
He called him a human tsunami on the nation. And changed. He wrote a lot of angry letters, to the papers in his later years, and he actually had me send via email a couple of jokes for Obama during the campaign about McCain, which I won't repeat here. Yeah. You
can repeat them.
Well,
can you repeat them?
I don't know.
Oh, okay. But I'm happy to hear them.
Yeah. He wrote a letter. The first year of the Bush administration was at 2001. Yeah. Dear editor, I hope nothing happens to Dick Cheney, or then George Bush will have to become president. So he was on it right away, and I think it kept him going for 8 years too. That anger, it keeps. There's a lot of energy flowing there.
Well, a lot of people who reach what we call retirement age, I think they lose track of part of the things that keeps them young and vital and going is having something to do and keeping their mind active. Some people, they think, I'm going to hit 65 and I'm going to play golf and I'm going to go fishing and I won't have to work again. And I mean, you look at a guy like Irv who kept going, kept doing things. It seems like that makes a big difference.
Well, he had a great family. He's got a wonderful wife. His widow, Norma Brecker, has been going out with me. I do slideshows about the book or at various clubs and libraries, and I've been up and down the West Coast anyway. And Norma Brecker comes with me. She has great stories about living with Irv and the director, she called him, and how when he got a walker, he called it the old rolls, and just the fun that they had. They used to do a lot of fishing together up in the Rogue River, and she's just been very enthusiastic about Irv. And, of course, like I said, when I met him, he was doing stand-up at 87, 88 because all of his friends were comedians and they'd all died. He was the last man standing. Mm-hmm. Benny and Burns and Burl and Gleason, all these guys, they're all gone.
I feel a little simpatico with you on this book because it's different, but I did a book, it's been out almost like 4 years now, with an old Jewish comic book artist and writer named Will Eisner, who covered the same era. I mean, he started in the mid 30s, and his career went. I mean, he was working up until the day he died at 87, which was 5 years ago. So I mean, he literally, in that sense, would have been a contemporary of Irv's. And I spent 3 years with him, hearing his stories, meeting people who knew him, and looking up all these stories and getting all this stuff. And so when I saw the way you worked on this, I felt very comfortable. It was a very familiar thing to me to be sitting at the foot of this great Jewish artist, whether it be Eisner or Brecker. So
that sounds terrific. I mean, read that.
We'll see what we can do.
Okay.
But it's a very unique opportunity to find someone who's still alive after all these years and is still in their right mind, has the stories. Did you ever? I mean, was there ever a moment where you questioned something that he told you and that you had to go, look it up or back it up because you thought, that can't be right? Irv must be losing his mind.
Well, there were some amazing things like that. For instance, he told me he discovered Ann-Margaret for Bye Bye Birdie. I was like, no way! Ann-Margaret, she had to be around, but he told me he went to see his friend, was it Burns, I think, was doing a show at Tahoe or Reno, and this singer came on, this singer-dancer, Ann-Margaret, and when he got back to L.A., he told the producers, she'd be good for Bye Bye Birdie, and so when they moved the stage version into a movie, that became it. I just couldn't believe that was the thing. He also told me when he did The Life of Riley that it was the very first sitcom, 1949. That was another thing. I was like, what? No, what about Lucy and the Honeymooners and all that? But I had looked it up, and there it was, 1949. Now, there's a new movie out about the Goldbergs, a documentary, right, by Aviva Kempner, who did the Hank Greenberg documentary, which was terrific. And this one says that the Goldbergs were actually the first sitcom, and they came on earlier in the year in 49 than did Irv's The Life of Riley. So I caught him. But he's got the Emmy. He's got the Emmy from 1950 sitting on his piano, and it was for... you know what? It wasn't even a sitcom. They didn't call them sitcoms. It was called the Best Filmed Series, I think, or Best Filmed Comedy Series. It was the first Emmy, 1950. They got it, and Jackie Gleason got it.
Wow.
Weird, huh? Jackie Gleason. Yeah. Again, Irv discovered him in a comedy club in L.A., Slapsy Maxie Rosenblum's, and he put him in The Life of Riley. If people know The Life of Riley, it was a radio show originally in 1943 with William Bendix. And it ran for a long time. And when it came time to TV in 49, Bendix said, I don't want to do it. I don't know about TV.
You did that voice very well. That sounded like Bendix.
Oh, really? Well,
I did.
It's hard to do it. Irv said Bendix was no Nostradamus because he didn't think TV was going to last. So he went out and hired Jackie Gleason, who said it was 5'10", 175 pounds, thin, and just the best he'd ever seen at reading a script and learning it. Nobody better than Gleason.
And the story leading up to Gleason was that I'm trying to remember, was it the sponsor or the producer or the agent, whoever was, said, you're going to have to go out and find somebody. And he's like, well, who am I going to get to play Riley? He says, it doesn't matter. It could be anyone. It's going to be a hit. It's like... Yeah, well, they almost took it off the air until he created the Digger O'Dell character, which was the friendly Undertaker, who came on with this very sepulchral voice. You're looking very natural. He was an Undertaker, a mortician, about talking jokes about death, and I don't think that had happened before. And letters came in from all over the country. The sponsor said, "Get rid of that character. We're canceling the show." Their sponsor was the American Meat Institute. Apparently, the embalmers use meat byproducts, and they were very worried about this character. But letters came in from all over the country saying, we love this guy, Digger O'Dell. We love that you're making fun about death. Young people, old people, morticians were writing in, and it saved the show. Digger O'Dell, who always, he had a catchphrase. He'd always end the scene with saying, well, I'll be shoveling off. It was such a deep, deep voice that he
spoke.
Yes.
The grass is always greener on the other fellow.
That was another great line. Yes, it's
John Brown was
someone. Oh, okay. You're talking to someone who's a great fan of that old radio stuff and has listened to many, many hundreds of hours of that stuff. So I loved going behind the scene on that. And Life of Riley is not one of the ones that everybody remembers. Even people who think they know stuff about old radio, they don't know that much about that one. So it's great to get the story.
Irv was that's something Irv was very proud of, that you could still get these old radio shows at various websites, and you could hear Riley on cassette and now on CD.
Yeah. Now, I wanted to ask you about that. You were asking him if he got money from that, and he said he did. He said, "Who do you think paid for lunch today?" At one point, I didn't think that those things were covered by copyright or that they were still being paid. Was that accurate?
Well, he was a rare owner of the property at that time. He was very smart. When he started the radio show, he owned it. So when it went to TV, he ended up selling it in syndication to NBC, and he made a bundle of money in the late 40s, which was unheard of at that time. And this kind of relates to all the questions about the Internet, and will people be paid for what they write on the Internet when it reappears? And he said that's so key to writers, owning and the union, the WGA, making sure that people got paid, because otherwise you can't have all this free content, or it would have been exploited in the Life of Riley days, and that's why he kept making money on it.
Interesting. If you own it, they will pay. I like that.
That is good, yeah. Make sure
you know what? It's funny. Eisner, who I mentioned before, was the same way. He owned everything that he did, unlike all the other creators in his industry. He maintained independence and ownership of what he owned. So the things that he did in the 40s were still paying him money in the 90s.
So when the Spirit movie came out, some went to his estate?
Oh, yeah. And if it had done well, they would have made a ton. Yeah.
That's right.
Oh, no, you do know who I'm talking about. You made that Spirit connection without me. Good.
Will Eisner, sure. I grew up on Creepy and Eerie and all those great drawn, and comics and underground comics and all that. Right,
and yeah, of course they're the same ones who produced that Spirit magazine. We must be of the same era, because that's how I first discovered him.
So how did you get the name Mr. Media?
Just took it.
Oh, okay. Because I used to do a character on the radio called the Mediatrician. People would call in and ask him questions. And help them with their media problems. Like, say there was a commercial they didn't understand, or they'd call in and say, "Why are there no video games about love?" and things like that. He tried to analyze the media, but it was always he worked in all 52 states, including the states of trance and confusion. He can help you with your problem.
I could fit into those states. Yeah, it was just 10, 12 years ago. I used to do it as a weekly syndicated newspaper column.
Oh, great.
And did that for several years, and then brought it back a couple of years ago as a podcast. And I stopped using the term podcast. I like to just think of it as a radio show now.
Great.
I found, while we were talking, I found another one of those Irv Brecker George W. Bush lines. Really? This is, let me see where this is from. I think this was from the celebration, I think the 60th anniversary of Meet Me in St. Louis. He says, at the end of this talk, he says, "One of the most pleasant things that I read was that among Ronald Reagan's favorite movies that he used to run in the White House was Going My Way and Meet Me in St. Louis." And then he says, "President Bush's favorite is the Texas Chainsaw Massacre."
Yeah. Well, that's the thing. I would really like if listeners were interested, they should hear him tell these stories. His voice was what blew me away about Brecker originally, because it sounded like Groucho Marx. If you go to YouTube and just type in Irv Brecker, Brecher, there will come up a 2-minute video that he cut for the Writers Guild when they were on strike. A couple of 2007, I think it was, and so you'll get to hear his voice, and it's amazing. He had the same timbre and resonance of a Groucho, and it sure puts his stories over so strongly, Takes you right back.
Oh, yeah. I wish I'd thought to do that. I sometimes try to get some audio clips, and it didn't even occur to me that there'd be something out there with Irv. But along that line, I wanted to ask you, you recorded so many of these conversations. Will we ever hear these conversations?
I'm trying to get an audio book together next, and it would be kind of a melange. It would be kind of a mixtape of audio books, since with this really small publisher, BenYehudaPress.com, we haven't been able to do an audio book, and I have friends who want to read it and people that do Groucho's voice, and I live in L.A., so there's people that want to do it, but I have, like you said, all these tapes, and a lot of them are in really good quality digital, from going around with him and taping his performances. So I'd really like to do it as a mix of him telling the stories, me asking him about the stories, and, as you say, audio clips from his movies would be great in there, too. So it'll be some kind of audio book, I hope, coming out.
That would be great. I'd love to hear it, and I suspect more people would as well. And so now you have your own career going on here. We haven't even talked about what you do. Tell us a little bit about your writing career, what you were doing before this, and then before we wrap up, I wanted to ask you what you'll be doing next.
Well, I started in radio, actually, in Detroit, and I've worked in radio in San Francisco, Minneapolis. Radio, you always get fired from your job. It's that kind of volatile business. Most people want to be in TV, so they have bad attitudes, and if you're trying to do something creative, you kind of get bounced. And I worked in New York, and I worked at Spy Magazine in New York. I ended up in L.A., working in public radio out there and telling stories on the public radio. But whatever I've done, I've kind of called myself over time a folk journalist. I like to just talk to people. I like to stick a microphone in their face and just hear their story. And that's kind of how I met Irv, as a folk journalist. And him telling me these stories. So I do stories about people in L.A. for public radio shows and freelance write as well. And I've done that for years now. So I'll probably just keep doing that. I'd like to get a radio show and play old clips and talk about these guys. But Irv opened up a world to me of old Hollywood that's just, it's so dreamy to me that it just doesn't exist today, of course. So I got to get the hell out of L.A.
So haven't set up for another book yet, huh?
Well, you know what? I almost want to do the outtakes, the parts that Irv wouldn't let me publish, because there's a lot of dirty stories that he didn't want in this book, and they're kind of funny.
I'm glad you mentioned that, because I wondered, there's some four-letter words here and there, and there's some references, but I kept thinking, oh, come on, the guys of that era, there's no dirty jokes here. There's no seamy kind of stuff. There's got to be. I mean, we're talking about, Milton Berle. I mean, there's references to Milton Berle's, manhood in passing, which, classic stuff. I heard Berle on Howard Stern talking about that stuff, and I thought, oh, come on. So if there's an outtake book to be written, put me down for a copy.
It would be great, because you got to start with Berle after all, and this was the era of vaudeville in the 1930s, and Berle put him on radio, and then he ended up coming out west with Berle to do a movie called New Faces of 1937. It's amazing, huh?
Oh, and you know what? I'm just reminded before we go. There's a great story. I should let you tell it, but I'll tell you where I'm going with it. There's a great story of Irv and Milton very early on. Milton was performing somewhere, and he says he's going to take Irv to visit his cousin. You know the story I'm talking about?
His cousin. He was playing Shays up in Buffalo, which is a great theater. Apparently it's still there. And he took Irv to his first cat house.
But he told him he was going to his cousins.
Yeah, his cousin. You'll love my cousins. And they'll really like you. And Berle took Irv on his first airplane ride and threw up on him. They were planes were different back then.
Now wait a minute, you got to go back and tell the rest of the cat house story, because Milton started doing what he became famous for 20 years later.
Dressing up.
Yeah, dressing up as a woman, and he's doing his act. And tell people what happened.
Well, they called it a Nancy act, I guess, then, the way you were shamming around and doing a kind of flirtatious dance. He said, so Berle starts going into doing this Nancy, and the owner of the brothel comes out and then throws him out. Was there something more to the story? I'm sorry.
Well, no, it was just he threw him out because he thought he was gay.
Yeah, right. Oh, God.
He thought, I just love that. And, of course, the fact that Milton became really who we know as Milton Berle now, when he started doing that on TV, and to think back to that story, it cracked me up. Well, folks, listen, you can order The Wicked Wit of the West by Irving Brecker, as told to Hank Rosenfeld, who I've been speaking with, at great bookstores everywhere, or more likely you can get it online at MrMedia.com, on Amazon.com, I think. Is that right, Hank? Yeah,
it's also at some of those Samuel French drama bookstores, if they're in your town.
Okay, and you can get it at the BenYehudaPress.com.
Correct.
Right? And then, Hank, are you on, do you Twitter, do you tweet, do you do Facebook, any of those places that people can find you?
I'm on Facebook, but if you go to npr.org, the public radio web, you can hear some of my stories on there.
Terrific.
Yeah.
Well, it's as I said when we started, it is a wonderful book. Anyone who's interested in the history of comedy in the United States and film, TV, theater, even to a degree, or any of these particular people, Milton Berle, the Marx Brothers, Jackie Gleason, even Judy Garland. You got to read this book. There's stories in here you will not see or hear anywhere else. It is a laugh every page, and I really recommend it. And
well, I love the guy. I love the guy. Like you said, you talked about Will Eisner. This was some people say the greatest generation. Irv was part of the funniest generation. And when they go away, it's up to the rest of us, right, to continue their stories.
Mm-hmm. Well, it's a great book, and Hank, thanks so much for coming on the show and sharing some stories of Irv and just chatting some more about it.
Oh, anytime. It's my pleasure, Robert.
All right, you take care, and thanks again.
Thank you.
All right.
Bye-bye.
And folks, for more comedy-related interviews, you can surf over to our main website, www.mrmedia.com. That's where you can listen to my earlier conversations with Lisa Lampanelli, Aziz Ansari, Judy Tenuta, Ralphie May, James P. Connolly, Ewell Spencer, Lisa Ann Walter, Michelle Ballin, Robert Schimmel, twice, Bob Alper, The Whitest Kids You Know, and many more. And please think about writing an online review of Mr. Media, casting a vote for Mr. Media, or marking Mr. Media as one of your favorites, whether you listen on Blog Talk Radio, TrueSlant, Digital Journal, Vox, Podcast Pickle, MediaFly, Blueberry, Zencast, Zimbio, or Odeo. And subscribe to Mr. Media on iTunes, and you'll never miss a show. Just search Mr. Media Interviews from within iTunes and subscribe for free. Or subscribe to Mr. Media's blog on the Amazon Kindle Reader. You can also listen with a piece of string and a tin can in many locations. If you've got an idea for a guest, email me directly at bob@andelman.com. That's ANDELMAN. You can also follow me on Facebook or on Twitter, www.twitter.com/Andelman. Thank you so much for joining us today. Always appreciate when you give up a little piece of your day and spend it with us. Thanks for listening, everybody.